Okay, we're talking about free will, and yesterday we reviewed it to some extent, and we also introduced a new perspective, and that was what I said is Maimonides' perspective. Let me review that briefly and see if there are any questions about that. If not, we will press on. The idea was this. Foreknowledge of free will is a contradiction. On the surface, it seems to be a contradiction between two propositions. One is that God knows everything, particularly knows the future, and the other is that we have free will. Now, if we give up describing God altogether, so we're not going to say that God knows everything, or that God knows anything. Certainly not going to say that God knows the future. Well, if you're worried about a contradiction between A and B, and you give up A, then you don't have a contradiction anymore. Of course, giving up saying God knows will not lead us to say God is ignorant. That's just another human description. The principle here is we're not going to talk about God at all. That definitely dissolves the problem of foreknowledge and free will. The question just then becomes, what are you left with? If you can't talk about God, so what happens to the whole tradition that's talking about God all the time? And the answer was, we're not going to talk about what God is, we're going to talk about what God does. We're going to describe his actions. So all of the words and phrases that are used on the surface to describe God, we put them through a three-stage translation process. Stage one, pretend that it's literally true that God is Q. Then ask, if God were really Q, what would he do? Stage three, subtract Q and just remain with a description of what he does. And I showed how that works for justice and for mercy, and even for knowledge. I pointed out that Utsato, the great Kabbalist, says it about knowledge twice on the same page. It's just a description of what God does. And I explained that knowledge will express itself in action by making sure that whatever happens is appropriately coordinated with everything else, just as an agent who really knew would take care to do. And then I said, this is not just an intellectual dodge. This is not just a way of protecting yourself against an objection, because very often in science and in philosophy, we are faced with exactly that situation. We know what something does. We don't know what it is. Very often there are investigations to try to figure out what it is. Sometimes they're successful. Sometimes, to date, they have not been successful. There's no dodge whatsoever in saying, I don't know what God is, I just know what he does. That's a common position in intellectual life. There's nothing intellectually suspect about it. That's all okay so far? And then someone suggested the idea that God is outside of time. That's certainly a correct way to handle the problem. If God is outside of time, you can't say he knew yesterday, because you can't put a date of yesterday on God or anything about God. So that's certainly a way out. But, and I used to teach it that way. I used to teach it as a separate way out. Only about a year ago, when I saw in a new magnificent edition of Maimonides' commentary on the Mishnah, there's an institute called the Maor Institute here in Yerushalayim, and they do very excellent scholarly work. They put out an 8-volume edition of his translating it from the Arabic, with references down to the contemporary literature. And in that compilation, I found a respondum of the Rivash, where he discusses this issue. And from his discussion, I realized that the solution I gave you and the solution of being outside of time are really based on exactly the same principle. They're not two different suggestions. So you go back to someone who wrote 500 years ago in our tradition, and you can learn something about contemporary philosophy. You can correct your understanding of contemporary philosophy. Let's review the solution that we said. The solution we said, taken from other sources, was when you did B and God knew you were going to do B, and then you imagine, what if I do A? Remember that God's knowing yesterday you did B, it depends upon what you did. Had you done something else, you would have known something else. They're connected. They're not independent. It's by assuming it's independent that you get the problem. Now, when you think of the idea of God being outside of time, what are you accomplishing? Why does that gain you anything? Because when you set up the problem and say he knew yesterday, the point of saying he knew yesterday was to put his knowledge outside of your control. That's the point of saying it that way. Because you assume if it's yesterday, it's done already. And if it's done already, I can't have any influence on that. The whole punch of the move of making his knowledge yesterday is to put his knowledge outside of your control. What's our response? It isn't outside of your control. It isn't, even though it's yesterday, it isn't. But that's the whole point of it. The point of it is to talk about it as being outside of your control. If so, put God outside of time. Okay. So I can't say that he knew it yesterday. Okay. Still, I could ask. His knowledge, wherever he is outside of time, is it independent of me? Is it absolute? Is it stuck, chiseled in stone, no matter what? Then you can manufacture the same problem over again. What's in his knowledge outside of time that I did B? Okay, now imagining I do A, I'm going to be in trouble. Imagining I do A is going to contradict that B that's stuck in his knowledge. The only way out is to make his knowledge dependent upon what I do, whether it's outside of time or in time. So being outside of time or in time doesn't affect the solution at all. It's not relevant to the solution at all. The crucial move is to say that his knowledge is dependent upon what I do. Once you do that, you can solve it whether God is in time or outside of time. So moving outside of time isn't really a separate solution. Yeah.
Then you're saying that the events correlate with my decision, right? So let's say I do things that correlate with my decision. Right?
What events correlate? Oh, you mean, yeah. I'm sorry. Okay, yeah.
Then at the last second, I knew that my events correlate to A. At the last second, I choose B, just to mess the system. So then what's the answer to that?
Very good. Very good. And the answer to that, that's a good question. And the answer to that is, the events correlate to your making a free choice. That's what the events correlate to.
But based on what Hashem, you're saying, Hashem knows. He knows based on the events I've done.
Yeah, but I'm subtracting the knowledge. I'm subtracting the knowledge, not taking the knowledge seriously anymore. Right? So the events have to correlate perfectly to everything that goes on. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's going on is I'm making a free choice. The events have to correlate perfectly to my making a free choice. Therefore, the events can't foreclose that. Then they're not correlating perfectly to my making a free choice. It's good. You asked that question. The question is asked, and that's the answer to it. But I didn't discuss it because it's a sophisticated question. If everybody got it. If you didn't get it, it's not important. Anyway, that's up to there. Now, what I would like to do now, at the risk of getting very subtle, is to share with you a question for which we don't have an answer. I think this is a good lesson in general. There are questions for which we don't have answers. You might not get that impression because we're all so well informed and so clever that we may answer all the questions that you have. But there are questions that we can't answer. And to explain to you how you live with a question that you can't answer. The fact that you can't answer a question doesn't mean necessarily you fold your cards and give up. There may be a way of living with the question even though you can't answer it. This question goes back to the Stoics. The Stoics were philosophers in the period when Rome was ascended. They inherited a lot from the Greeks. They put their own spin on things, inferior to the Greeks, but that's what they had. And they raised a question about free will, which is a bona fide question to this day, even though there are a couple of contemporary philosophers who think they have an answer to it. The vast majority disagree with them. I'm not inclined to be impressed with the vast majority, to tell you the truth, but I'm reporting what the views are. So I'll explain the problem to you, and we should discuss it to make sure we are on the same page with respect to the problem, and then I'll explain to you how we live with it. Let's review the picture that we have of people making decisions. When I come to make a decision, there's a lot already going on in me. I come with a full-blown psychology. I have desires, hopes, fears, scruples, values. When I'm confronted with an option, let's say between A and B, all those kick in. I may want A more than B, but I may be afraid of A, fear B less. My values may tell me that B is more important than A. All these things kick in, and they are my given motivations with respect to A and B. But they don't fully determine what I do. If they fully determined what I do, I wouldn't have free will. In addition to all those motivations, there's also free will. It's an interesting question, how much leverage free will has. Can free will just overrule all the rest of my motivations? Are there limits on how much purchase free will has? I think there are limits, and some Jewish sources indicate that there are limits. It's an interesting question. So think of free will as one of the forces in the field, and you start with all your motivations, and then you make a free will decision, and the free will decision, at least sometimes, determines the outcome. The Stoics asked the following question. We'd like some more positive information about this free will. You told us you're not totally caused from the outside. Okay. That's why you put in the free will box, which operates on its own. Okay. But so far, as you've described, the free will box is just a cipher. It's just an X. You've told us nothing about how it operates. And in particular, the Stoics said, we would like you to answer whether it operates in one of two possible ways. And they're the only two possible. There's no other choice. Does free will operate according to rules, or does it not? Does free will have a set of rules so that when A and B are presented, free will says, okay, let's calculate desire, let's calculate scruples, let's calculate the effect of the stock market, let's calculate whether it's blue or green, let's calculate all these things, give them numbers, divide by 17, multiply the square root of 2, and see if you came out with something better than 63. And that's what you choose. Does free will operate by rules or does it not? And the Stoics weren't just putting this as an inquiry. The Stoics said, we will show you that either answer is going to get you into trouble. Either answer is going to get you into trouble. And since you got to answer one or the other, either it does or it doesn't, so you're in trouble. That's the Stoics' approach. Let's try. Let's say there are rules. Check this, check that, multiply, divide, paint it green. And then that tells you what to do. So the Stoics say, where did the rules come from? Where did they come from? Free will is operating according to rules. Where did the free will get those rules to operate by? Is free will in the soul created by God? Okay, then those rules are created in you by God, and God is an external cause, isn't he? And if he's an external cause, and you've got your given motivations plus free will with the rules that God caused, then in the end, everything you do is because of the external cause. And you told us, say the Stoics, you told us that external causes take away your free will and you're not responsible anymore. What are you going to tell me? Your parents taught them to you? Your society runs by those rules? You imbibe them with your Wheaties when you ate Wheaties for breakfast? All that is external. It seems that if free will is going to operate according to rules, if you trace where the rules come from, eventually you're going to come to an external cause, which means, according to your pictures, say the Stoics, you're not really free. Okay, let's try the other alternative. It doesn't operate according to rules. It doesn't operate according to rules. So let's picture this. I'm choosing between A and B, and I have desire and scruples and fears and hopes and all that stuff. And then I got the free will box. And the free will box looks at A and B and says, B. Why? Why? We're saying there are no rules. No rules. So it just sort of pops off. It just sort of pops spontaneously, arbitrarily, randomly. Could that make you responsible for what you do? Just a spontaneous random pop that picks B over A? Is that the picture of an agent who's responsible for what he does? Because he has in there something that snaps randomly and arbitrarily? By the way, couldn't you build a random element into a computer? Yes, you could. It's very easy. Build a random element. Would you then say the computer's responsible for what it does? Surely not. So say the Stoics, we think you're stuck. If free will operates according to rules, and you ask where the rules come from, you're going to trace them eventually outside of yourself, and you're going to have to acknowledge there's an external cause, even for the free will, which means everything's externally caused, which means according to you, you don't have free will, and you're not responsible. And if you say free will operates without rules, then it's just popping off randomly, and that's not a reason to think that you're responsible for what you do. So either way, you end up with a picture that doesn't explain responsibility. So the Stoics say, you're stuck. You haven't got a picture of why we're responsible for what we do. You invented free will to make us responsible. That's what you told us at the beginning. That's what I said at the beginning. The whole point of free will is because you're only responsible if you have free will. Say the Stoics, if you just push a little bit, you'll see that your picture of free will, the way action takes place, does not enable you to explain how you are responsible for what you do. That's the Stoics' problem. You hear the problem? Okay, let's try a trick. Often people say, well, that's really too extreme. Either this or that. Maybe it's a combination. Maybe from society or from my parents or reading, certain rules do get registered in my free will. But maybe in the end, I make my own free choice which rules to keep and which rules not to keep and how to adopt them and how to apply them. So it's not purely rules and it's not purely random. It's just a combination of the two together. And that would be a third position that you haven't addressed. But that won't do, because that just pushes the whole problem up one level. Okay, there are these rules that have been programmed in you by society, by your parents and so on and so on. And now you're telling me you decide which rules to accept, which rules to reject, and how to apply them. Let's ask about that super decision, that meta decision, which rules to keep and which rules to jettison, how to apply them. How is that decision made? Is it made according to rules? Or is it not made according to rules? And the very same argument repeats itself one level up. It's made according to rules, the rules come from outside, and it's not made according to rules, then it's random. It's just pushing the whole question up one level. You can't avoid the Stoics' remarks that way. So we have a problem. And as I say, to this day, there's no accepted, agreed upon solution to the problem. What to do? I want to show you two ways to live with the problem. First of all, what kind of evil brew are we preparing here? What concepts are we using in cooking up this problem? Well, we're using the concept of human responsibility, and the concept of freedom, and the concept of causation, and the concept of rules. Now, I tell you, every one of those concepts is dreadfully controversial and very poorly understood. New books come out on each of those concepts every year, and philosophy is divided widely in understanding each of those concepts. Is it really shocking that we take four poorly understood concepts and put them together and end up in a confusion? Let me give you a point of comparison. How many people have heard of Zeno? Zeno was a pre-Socratic philosopher. We don't have his writings, but we have what preserved, especially in Aristotle. Zeno had some arguments that nothing moves. Nothing moves. Motion is an illusion. Nothing can move. I'll give you a taste of the argument. One argument is like this. You think things move? Well then, imagine a race. This is a handicap race. You know what a handicap is? The faster runner starts ahead, and the slower runner starts behind, so it'll be interesting. There are handicap races that are actually run that way. Okay, now Zeno says, I will show you that the runner behind, even though he runs faster, can never pass the runner in front. He can never pass him. Here's how. Let's divide the race into stages. Stage one, the runner behind runs up to where the one in front starts, during which time, of course, the one in front runs ahead. That's stage one. Stage two, the runner behind runs up to the spot where the runner in front got to in stage one, during which time the runner in front runs ahead a bit. Now, it's true it gets less and less. But what's stage three going to be? I bet you can guess by now, right? Stage three, the one behind runs up to where the one ahead got up to in stage two, during which time the one ahead runs ahead a bit, right? Stage four, stage five, stage six, stage 174. Are we ever going to run out of stages? Isn't there always going to be another stage where the one behind runs up to where the one ahead was, and during that time the one ahead runs a little bit ahead? There's an infinity of stages. You never run out of stages, so you're never going to get to pass him. That was one of the arguments. Another argument was this. Imagine an arrow, you who believe in motion, imagine an arrow that flies from A to B. Okay? Now, picture the arrow at any instant of time. Where is the arrow at an instant of time? It's in one place. At each instant of time, it's in one place. Well, of course, when you are in one place, you're not moving, right? When you're in one place, you're stationary. So then it means at every instant in time, the arrow is in exactly one place, which means at every instant in time it's not moving, which means it's not moving. Okay, now, if you're not convinced, you're in good company. But look, these arguments existed for 2,300 years without response. 2,300 years without response. Most people think that in the 19th century, when the continuum was put on a solid basis by Weierstrass and Riemann and others, with the theory of limits, that we finally put it on a solid foundation. With the continuum, you can solve the problem. Our contemporary philosophers think that doesn't work either. What did people do for 2,300 years with simple, clear arguments that nothing moves? Did anybody say, golly, that's what philosophers are good for? They've taught us that nothing moves. Motion is all an illusion. Nobody said that. Not even Zeno said that. What they said was, golly, those are very clever arguments. There's got to be something wrong with them. There's got to be something wrong with them because it's obvious that things move. But what's wrong with them? And it's interesting to think about it. Maybe someone someday will figure out what's wrong with these arguments. It is a matter of keeping your philosophical balance, about which I will speak more if we have time. But the point is, that's the natural and appropriate conclusion when you're confronted with those arguments. There's got to be something wrong. There's got to be something wrong. I don't know what it is. Maybe nobody else knows what it is. But motion is too obvious to be killed by arguments like that. Now, my point is this. What I'm telling you is standard. This is what I'm telling you now is standard. My point is only this. Zeno cooked up his arguments with very simple, everyday concepts that we know very well. We know what space is. We know what motion is. We know what time is. If I tell you on July 16th at 12 noon, we should meet in downtown Los Angeles at such and such a restaurant, we will not have difficulty in keeping that date. It's in the future and it's someplace far away and so forth and so on. We navigate space and time very well, with very great accuracy. We put people on the moon and put satellites even further out. We navigate space and time very well. And Zeno, taking these everyday concepts that we navigate very well, cooked up a paradox. A paradox that exercised the world for at least 2,300 years. Should we be shocked that we take four very poorly understood concepts and cook up a paradox? I think we should say that's just a testimony to the fact that we understand these concepts very poorly. And when you have poorly understood concepts and you put four of them in the same bag, you're likely to get difficult conclusions. Quite right. And we should at least accept as a realistic possibility or probability that when we understand this concept better, the problem will go away. That's one way to live with the problem, which I think is intellectually perfectly appropriate. Yeah.
Why can't the answer to the free will question that you asked, that still has no solution to this day, be that free will is relative? Why can't that be? That free will is relative.
What does that mean? Free will is relative to what?
Relative to your conditions, your external conditions. Why can't we?
Let's see. Relative is an interesting idea. Relative usually means that you have a concept which, until you specify what it's related to, doesn't have any particular content. When you make it related, it has a content. John is tall. True or false? Well, how tall? John is taller. True or false? Taller than who? Taller than what? If you don't say, you haven't said anything. X is moving. Moving with respect to what? Motion is a relative concept. I'm not now moving with respect to the earth. I am now moving with respect to the moon, to the sun, because the whole earth is moving with respect to the sun, and I'm sitting on the earth. If you ask, am I moving without telling me relative to what? You haven't asked the question because it's incomplete. Now you're telling me free will is relative. First of all, that would mean free will without filling in what it's relative to is incomplete somehow. When I fill in what it's relative to, it becomes complete. I don't hear why it's incomplete to start with. And what is it I should fill it in with respect to make it complete? My condition? But of course, my free will. Of course, it's a question of my condition.
Your external factors, how you're brought up. That's the free will I'm talking about. Because you said you're always going to have external factors.
Let's take the example that I gave at the beginning, when we first started this. Someone pushes someone down a flight of stairs. Relative to his external factors, or not relative, or however you say it, does he have free will? He does? When he's pushed down a flight of stairs?
Oh, him, the one that's pushed.
The one that's falling down the
It wasn't
stairs.
his fault that he got pushed. It wasn't his fault.
So he's not exercising free will, right?
No.
Since he was pushed.
Correct.
Okay. And if I have a case where there's no external cause
He got a crap.
forcing him to do what he does, and the choice comes from within him, then that's a free choice. So where does making it relative help?
I feel like everyone at one point can, like, based on their way they're brought up, has their own type of free will, and that's relative to whether God.
Oh, that's true. What choices I have in front of me are relative to me, that's for sure, and relative to my knowledge. I may have an illness and I don't know what the cure is. So relative to me, I don't have the choice to cure myself because I don't know what the cure is. That's always true. What choices you have and how difficult the choices are going to be relative to your upbringing and your knowledge base, your resources. That's for sure true. But we're talking now about whether there's free will at all or zero. Whether it's a reality or whether it's just an illusion, a fiction, a fantasy. I don't see how making it relative is going to help. The amount of free will, the alternatives, and the difficulty, if we have time, we'll talk about all those things. So that's one way to live with it, to say that it's a conceptual confusion, as in the past there have been many conceptual confusions, and there's another one on the grounds that the concepts we're using are very poorly understood. There's another way to live with it, and that is, according to our point of view, free will takes place in the soul. Free will is essentially a spiritual matter. Do we expect to understand the soul? Is Jewish teaching that the soul is something that we should expect to understand wholly and completely well? The answer is no. The soul expresses God's presence in the world more so than anything else that he created. I told you yesterday that when you come into this world, your ability to understand is stepped down drastically, so that any spiritual concept that you grasp through physical experience. There will be spiritual concepts that you can't grasp through physical experience, and then you're not going to get them at all. We don't expect to understand the soul completely. We may understand certain aspects of it. We don't expect to understand it completely. So the other way to live with the problem is to say free will is a matter of how the soul operates, and we don't expect to understand that. So we have two ways to live with the problem, even though we can't solve it. Okay, time for a short quiz. Which way is right?
Relative about which act?
That way.
About which act?
Which way is right? Well, if someday philosophers will solve the conceptual problem, or come to understand the four concepts better, and the problem will go away, then we will know that the problem was really conceptual. It's a mistake, it was just our confusion, and we've cleared it up, and we now know that that's the correct way to handle it. And if we don't get a conceptual solution, then what should we conclude?
No, we can't conclude that there is none.
Correct. What we should conclude is we don't know whether there really is a conceptual confusion, which we haven't been able to clear up, or it's part of the soul's operation, which we can't understand in principle. We wouldn't know what to conclude. Either way, I don't have to fold my cards because I have a problem that I can't solve. Are we together? Now, this is a very important general position in life. You have a position, somebody raises an objection, and you can't answer it. Does that mean you have to give up your position? The answer is no. It does not mean that. It doesn't mean it in science, it doesn't mean it in logic, it doesn't mean it in philosophy, it doesn't mean in normal everyday life, and it doesn't mean it in religion either. He died recently, a famous philosopher named Richard Rorty. I mentioned him only to dissociate myself from him. I cannot abide his philosophy in general in any way, shape, or form. He's a real relativist, and he came into severe criticism by the philosophers I respect for that. But I saw him at a convention, a philosophy convention, and he made the following remark. Every scientific theory, from the moment it was proposed, had counterexamples it could not answer. Every scientific theory, from the moment it was proposed, had counterexamples it could not answer. This picture that you have on the street, you have a theory and you run up against an objection. Then you get another theory which has no objections and you replace it. That picture is never correct. What you're always doing is trading one theory with its problems for another theory with its problems. And then you have to make an evaluation. Which theory is superior with its problems? And he said, we have no clue how that evaluation is made. We have no good description of how this judgment is made to junk this theory for that theory. I think that's correct. It's profound. Most philosophers of science agree with it. And that being the case, the fact that there is a problem doesn't mean that you give up your theory. I'll give you a couple of examples. According to Newton's picture of the world, well, there are two. One's simple to state, but hard to explain. The other one's a little more complicated, but it can be explained. The planets go around the sun in an ellipse. Not only do they go around the sun in an ellipse, but in some cases, the ellipse itself revolves around the sun. So the motion looks like this. It starts like this, and then it goes like this, and then it goes like this, and then it goes like this, and it goes like this. Not only does it go around an ellipse, but the whole ellipse. That's called the precessional parahelion. Mercury's ellipse goes around like that. According to Newton's theory, it shouldn't go around. Newton could not explain why the ellipse goes around. Einstein writes, when he was working out his theory of relativity, he tackled that problem. And he calculated it. And he calculated that it should go around at exactly the speed it goes around. He said that was one of the greatest days of his life. He solved a problem which Newton for 300 years couldn't solve. You can imagine a triumph that is. Right? Okay, but why didn't people just give up Newton in the meantime? Why did they give it up? Because they said, okay, Newton's theory can't explain it, but maybe there's some other factor. Maybe there's some other feature, or maybe there's some minor adjustment on the edge, and that'll take care of it, and we just haven't found it yet. And that's not just crazy, because at one time, in the beginning of the 19th century, the farthest out planet that they knew of was Uranus. They analyzed its motion, and guess what? It didn't match the Newtonian laws. Did not match the Newtonian laws. Noticing that, publishing it, there were two schools of thought. One is, well, Newton's wrong. Look, Newton predicts how it's going to move, and it doesn't move that way. We base our science on observation. We see it's not moving that way. Newton's wrong. Another school of thought was, no, there's something else out there that we haven't found yet. That something else out there is jiggling Uranus and making it move in a wrong way. Newton's right. But there's something else out there that's moving it. Okay, at that point you couldn't tell. You couldn't tell which was correct. They did some very careful calculations. And they said, if we're right, and if Newton's right, then the thing that's doing the jiggling ought to be right there. They sent a letter to an astronomer and said, at such a time of night, point your telescope in such and such a direction, and you'll discover a new planet. And they did. That's the planet Neptune. It was discovered by calculation. I just read a history of it. I'm not sure it's right or wrong. But they said, isn't that great? That is great. That's a triumph. They said the very day that he received the letter, the astronomer looked up that night and he found it. I'm like, okay, but that's a triumph. The sky is big. And that far out, the sky is gigantic. To say, point it there at that time and you'll find a planet, that's astonishing. So if you have that experience with Newton, you think, wow, this theory's pretty good. This theory really has it solid. So okay, here's something you can't explain. I'm not going to give up a good theory because it's one thing you can't explain. Maybe we'll find something else. Maybe something else is jiggling the orbit of Mercury. Or maybe there's some minor adjustment because of sun flares or something that we're not taking into account. Who knows? The fact that there's a problem against your theory doesn't mean that your theory should be given up. You have to make a delicate evaluation of whether the problem is clearly so central and so destructive that you have to give it up. And those evaluations are made from time to time in science. Now, I must tell you, when I was becoming religious and I started learning Talmud, I was impressed by the number of times the Talmud takes a position and raises objections, and the end of the discussion is the word kasha, meaning we can't answer the objection. Which means that the Talmud is honest and hiding problems from the naive, lest they lose their faith or become unsure and uncertain. No, the problems are right out there in a public document that everybody should be studying. And they put the problems on the page. If there are these unsolved problems, how can you maintain the system? Because the judgment is made that these are peripheral. They're out at the edge. And the solutions, whatever they are, will come without causing us to adjust the central principles of the position. And therefore the position can be maintained. There's nothing wrong with that. So that being the case, the fact that there are objections that you can't answer doesn't mean that you give up your position. It depends upon how central and how solid the objections are. Yeah.
I don't understand, but I never understood why when things reach the speed of light, Newtonian mechanics don't work. Why does the Newtonian mechanics don't work when things reach the speed of light?
Newtonian mechanics do work. Indeed, according to Newton, the speed of light is infinite. Light moves instantaneously. There's no such thing as a limit of the speed of light. It was discovered later that light moves at a certain speed, but until you get to relativity, there's no reason why things can't move faster than light.
You can't use Newtonian equations to solve those problems.
Well, it depends on what problems you have. If the problem is how fast is it moving, you won't get an answer because the answer is infinity.
Okay. So
but then there isn't a speed at which it's moving. If it moves instantaneously from here to there, then there isn't a speed at which it's moving. There isn't such a speed. So why should you get an answer?
That's what I don't.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's a problem. Only with relativity do you have a speed limit in the universe that nothing can move faster than the speed of light. But before that, as I said, Newton's original theory was that light moves infinitely fast. So does gravity, according to Newton. Only with relativity is there a speed limit to how fast influences can move. Okay. All right. A remark now about the psychology of free will. Just following up on what you said before, and I think it's very important. First of all, free will can be more or less in two different ways. One way is the number of alternatives you have. You're facing a problem and you say, golly, it's A or B. A is terrible and B is terrible. And somebody comes along and says, oh, you missed C. C is another option. You now have more free will because you have more options open to you. And that may be very good for you because C may be superior to the other two. One of the things you do when you have a problem is look for new solutions. When we do this, talk to people and say, look, I'm facing this. I don't see a way out. Their experience may have taught them that there are other ways out. The other way in which free will can be more or less is the difficulty of making the choice. Let's say it's a clear choice between something that's right and something that's wrong. The more difficult the choice of right is, in a sense, you could say the less free will you have. For sure, the more difficult the choice is, the less you are responsible for failure. The more difficult the choice of right is, the less responsible you are for failure. Here's a case, I don't know if I mentioned this to you before, but this is also a generally important thing. You can trust your moral intuitions. Almost always, maybe always, when something seems right to you, or wrong to you, or good to you, or bad to you, you can trust your moral intuitions, that Judaism will follow them as well. You're not going to have to say, well, it seems horrible, a horrible crime. Judaism says so, then it's got to be okay, even though if you knew more about it, if you had more information, you'd see that your moral intuitions are correct. And here, the harder it is to do something, when a person fails, we let him off the hook. And we say, that was such a difficult challenge. It was so difficult to do, so hard to do. He's less responsible for failure. You've seen these. You know what these are. These are tzitzis. You probably have heard, some of you, that there used to be a blue thread. There are people actually today who wear the blue thread as well. The blue thread was and is very expensive. Now the Talmud says, if you wear all white, you've satisfied the mitzvah. If, in fact, you wore all blue, you'd also satisfy the mitzvah. Just that, preferably, you should have white and blue in the appropriate numbers. Now, the Talmud says, if a person failed by having all white versus another person who failed by having all blue, which is the worse failure? For which one is the person more responsible? For which one would the person be held to a stronger penalty?
White.
If he had
blue.
Yeah, he knows better. If he has all blue, it's worse. Because why? Because if he has all blue, what did he omit? He omitted the white. The white are trivial. They're pennies. What, you didn't bother to spend a few pennies to get the white and do it in the best way? That's a terrible failure. The blue was very expensive. Imagine a person saying, Because the blue is very expensive. I'm a limited budget. I'm just not going to do it. There you understand. He's fighting something that's important to him. Yes, he should have given it up. He should have spent the money. Within limits, okay. Should have spent the money. But I know what he's sacrificing. I know what he's up against. He's up against trying to save money. That's a lesser failure. Now the person isn't willing to spend a few pennies to pick up the white ones. Let's suppose that an action requires heroism to perform, and a person fails. Then he has failed to be a hero. Is that a big failing or a little failing?
Little.
It's a little failing. Failed to be a hero. How many people are heroes? How many people can live up to being a hero? That's a small failure. If he didn't do something that's everyday and obvious and easy, that's a big failure. It's a terrible failure. Now, this plays a role in assessing responsibility in very extreme cases. A puts a gun to B's head and says, do X. X is the sort of thing which, according to Jewish law, you have to die rather than commit. Let's say idol worship. So A says to B, bow to the idol. And B is considering his options. Well, not hard to spell them out. It's bow and live or don't bow and die. Now let's imagine as he's considering his options, Reuben and Shimon show up and they say, B, you know what you're risking here? We're watching you. We're warning you. This is idol worship. This isn't trivial. This is idol worship. The penalty for idol worship is death at the hands of the court. So watch what you do. And B says, I know, I hear you, but I just can't die. I can't do it. I can't just allow him to shoot me. And he bows to the idol. What penalty will B get? None. He gets no penalty. Because since he was facing the threat of death with a gun, that's considered to be too hard a choice to make. To be willing to die is heroism. The failure to die is just a failure to be a hero, and for that you don't get capital punishment. And it's true for all of them. All of the commandments for which you're supposed to die. If you are threatened with death and you fail to live up to the requirement to die, you don't get executed. Even with witnesses and warning, because it's too much. It's too much to ask. Okay, I'm skipping over certain details. That's for the recording. Okay. But that's the basic idea. It's too much. You can't ask that of a person. Now, there are many such principles that are less dramatic, less drastic, but also reduce a person's responsibility for failure. Whether he has an overwhelming desire close to an addiction, or whether he's ignorant or he's lacking training. All these things are taken into account in determining how responsible a person is. I'll give you one dramatic illustration of this. Maimonides in the Laws of Repentance, chapter 3, says, God judges people on the basis of the majority of their performance. If the majority of the performance is good, the person's a tzaddik, a righteous person, and he lives. If a person slips over the 50% line, 50% minus 1, minus epsilon, not 49% for people who know, 50% minus 1, no matter how small, instantly he dies. Miyad hu meis. That's what Maimonides says. The Rabbi, Maimonides' famous critic, says on the spot, what are you talking about? We know lots of wicked people who don't die. By the way, if you ever study Maimonides and study his critic, the Rabbi who's printed on the page with Maimonides' text, sometimes the Rabbi is very rough on Maimonides. Sometimes he says it's mixed up, it's not true, it's a mistake, and so on and so on. He's really pretty tough on Maimonides. What people who are not initiated into the history don't realize is that the Ravid was older than Maimonides. He's older than Maimonides. Maimonides was an up-and-coming, a fresh young scholar, publishing his works. The Ravid was sitting in France with his house of study, with his colleagues, and the parchments are coming to him, and he's reading them, and he's passing judgment of the older generation on this young up-and-coming scholar. Does it make sense? It doesn't make sense. He had no hesitation in criticizing Maimonides. Why shouldn't he? He's a world-famous, established scholar. Someone later would never write that way about Maimonides' work. Well, almost never. There are a few exceptions, but because they were treated with much more respect. Anyway, Ravid writes, what are you talking about? We see wicked people who live. What do you mean slipping over the 50% line? The Kesef Mishnah, a later commentator on Maimonides, says if you read on the Maimonides text, you'll see the answer to the Ravid's objection. Maimonides goes on to say, when I'm talking about a 50% line, how do you make that calculation? You don't make it by counting up actions. These actions were legal and good. These actions were illegal and bad. Count them up and make a total. That's not how you do it, says Maimonides. Because sometimes a single good action can outweigh many failures. And sometimes a single failure can outweigh many good actions. So you have to take into account the seriousness of the action, not just the number. Okay, that's fairly obvious. Some commandments are much more important than other commandments. But Maimonides goes further, he says, and who can make this calculation? Only God. And he gives God a title taken from the book of Samuel, Kael Deos. Kael Deos means the God who knows the inner personality of each person. Hannah, when she has a child, speaks of one of her critics and speaks of God knowing the inner motivation of people. And that she gives him the title Kael Deos, a God of knowing the personalities of people, their inner character. Now, Maimonides is telling me, when you calculate, when it is calculated, I can't calculate it, when the calculation is made, is he over the 50% line? Calculation is made by God who knows his inner character. What is Maimonides saying? He's saying, when you look at a person, a human being, person living, acting out in his life, you can't evaluate his actions on the basis of the movements of his body. A human action is more than the movement of a body. Human action is the expression of a personality enacted in will. You have to know all of the personality that's behind it. What is he struggling with? What are his inspirations? What are his pitfalls? What are his blind spots? You have to take all of that into account when you evaluate what a person does. Therefore, says the Kesef Mishnah, when we look at a person and say, oh, he's so wicked, he should die, drop dead right away, according to Maimonides, we're looking from the outside. Even Samuel the prophet, Samuel who's compared to Moses and Aaron in the famous verse in Psalms, when God says to Samuel, go to Yishai, one of his children's going to be king. That's David, Yishai's father. Go to Yishai. So Samuel goes to Yishai and says, gather your sons, one of them's going to be king. Fine, brings in his sons. For a certain reason I can't go to now, he leaves David outside. And Samuel looks at the oldest of the sons. And Samuel's very impressed. He's very impressed. And he thinks to himself, this must be the one that God has chosen. And God says to him, that one? Steve, I'm disgusted with him. And he says to Samuel, man looks with the eyes, God sees into the heart. He's talking to Samuel the prophet, a prophet who in some respect is equal to Moses and Aaron. And he said, I don't care if you're a prophet, you can't see the heart. Only God can see the heart. Only God can see the heart. So that means that the significance of the action depends upon, as I started to say 7 minutes ago, the amount of free will you have. The amount of free will you have depends very greatly on your personality, on your training, on your background, on your society, on your profession. All of this is going to determine your struggles, your inspirations, and your pitfalls, and that will determine the extent of the free will that you have. And no one can know that other than God. And that's why it's a cardinal rule in Judaism that we don't judge people. We don't judge people. We judge actions, but not people. Only when you have a prophet who tells you that this person is wicked, or you have the rabbis of the Talmud or the Midrash who had divine inspiration, who could tell you the character of a person because they get it from God. But other than that, we don't judge people. We just judge actions. So that's a very, very profound attitude. This bears fruit in a very interesting way. Suppose a person commits a crime, which is a capital crime. I'll tell you in a moment what that means. And he's going to be executed. The Talmud says, choose for him a mode of execution that will be as painless as possible. And all four methods of execution were arranged in such a way that they would be as painless as possible. Why? Why should I do that? Says the Talmud, because the commandment to love your friend as yourself applies to the person who's going out to be executed. You still have a commandment to love your friend as yourself. He said, what are you talking about? He's a criminal. Yeah, okay, he's a criminal. But I'm filling in now. You don't know why he's a criminal. You don't know what was pushing him. You don't know what he was struggling with. And that being the case, you still have to love him. You still have to love him. There's only one exception to that, where the Torah says not to love the person. But in standard capital crimes, you have to still love him. Now, let me say one more word. I'm drifting a little bit, but it's an important point. As I mentioned, I want to get it on the table. Many people are concerned. There are certain crimes, which are capital crimes, which it's hard to explain and justify. Guy lights up a cigarette on Shabbos. For that, he's got to die. I mean, okay, Shabbos is a rule. Shouldn't violate rules. Listen to the scenario that the Talmud requires in order to enforce capital punishment. In order for him to be subject to capital punishment, before he lights up the cigarette, someone has to say to him, hey, it's Shabbos. And the penalty for lighting up a cigarette on Shabbos is death. And there have to be two witnesses watching him when he does this. Now let me ask you a question. George wants a cigarette. Reuven wants a cigarette. Wants a cigarette? About to light it up. Shimon and Levi come around the corner. Hey, Reuven! It's Shabbos. What are you doing? You're going to die. Suppose Reuven wants the cigarette. What's he going to do? It slipped my mind. Thank you. You just saved my life. Slipped my mind. Have a nice day. And as they drift around the corner, he'll light up a cigarette. If he wants a cigarette, that's what he's going to do. Why would he say to them, I know it's Shabbos. I know it's wrong. I know I'm going to die. Watch in your face! And he lights it up. What is he doing? He's not doing that because he wants a cigarette. He wants to make a public anti-Torah demonstration. That's what the person dies for. Not for the desire for the action per se, but for the decision to make a public anti-Torah demonstration. Because otherwise, he would simply stop it now and then pick a better circumstance in which he could do it without witnesses watching him. That, I think, reduces the pressure on the idea of the death penalty to a very great extent. It's not the activity per se, it's the public anti-Torah demonstration.
You have to tell them the consequence, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So I've been in that situation before, but I didn't tell the person the consequence. I just told them, Shabbos. But I didn't tell them the consequence.
But it's a different time period. It's only
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, but
nowadays,
still,
we don't have a court that can do that.
Yeah, I know, but still.
We don't have
Like,
it's not
still tell them the
practical.
consequence.
Yes, you have to tell
And
them.
he has to say what he said.
That's right. You're right. He has to say, even so. If they answer you back, even so, I'm doing it.
Like even when it was
Right?
there,
So that guy is clearly, he's out to spite the Torah in public. That's all.